begin Unit 3, which covers the New Deal and World War II. First thing we're going to talk about is the 1920s and the political and economic environment of the 1920s. Of course, the progressive era was an era of progressive liberal policies and were dominated, I won't say dominated, but shared at least between the Democrats and the Republicans, who were both relatively progressive and liberal parties. But after World War I, the Republicans kind of transitioned to what we now know the Republicans as the more conservative party. And the election of 1920 represented that. Warren G. Harding from Ohio wins the election over the Democrat, James Cox, with a motto of a return to normalcy. Now, what that implies is that the previous period was abnormal, if you want to return to normalcy. And what he's talking about here is the progressive era. And the idea that the progressive era, and this idea that the progressive era, of course, which sought to use government in a proactive way to solve economic and social problems, was abnormal. And really, if you look at the American history up to that point, they are correct, because the federal government especially had never involved itself much in social or economic policy. So the idea was to return to that hands-off attitude of the federal government. But like I said, he defeats James Cox. But notably, the Franklin Roosevelt was the vice presidential candidate at that time under Cox, and who, of course, we will hear from him later. Now, Harding's presidency was relatively short, but it's notable because of the corruption that occurred during his administration by what's called, the Ohio Gang, which is basically a bunch of his friends, really, and acquaintances from Ohio that he put in positions of power that basically did what they wanted to and kind of pilfered the government and were corrupt in a lot of different ways, including corruption in the Veterans Bureau and the Teapot Dome scandal, which is basically, if I remember correctly, it's a scandal which involved the Interior Department taking bribes for access to oil leases on federal land. But anyway, this was going on, supposedly it was going on without Harding's knowledge, and history has never really been able to prove that Harding knew what was going on. But Harding did die in office, and by natural causes, and the country mourned quite a bit because he died before it became public knowledge that all this corruption occurred. Now, Harding, once that news came out, the people's opinion of him dropped dramatically. And generally, to this day, when historians rank presidents, generally Harding is towards the very bottom, usually in the bottom 5 to 7 of all presidents with regard to how successful they are and how good of presidents they are. Now, taking his place after he dies was his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. He was called Silent Cal, simplistic and inactive. He believed in a hands-off government, and he liked to live simply. Now, that didn't mean he was dumb, because he was not. He was a very smart person, but he believed that the office of the president should, not be progressively active. So he took over for Harding after he dies, and then ran for re-election on his own in 1924 and won by a landslide. Now, this landslide victory of this Republican former vice president of Harding, kind of affirmed this and reaffirmed the post-war conservatism, this idea of rejection of progressivism. And he continued Harding's policies of rolling back progressive business regulation and business reform. So but he served only one term after his first election, and in the election of 1928, Herbert Hoover, Republican, will run against the Democrat Alfred Smith, who was notably a Catholic, which was very rare at the time for a non-Protestant to run for as a major candidate for president. He was the support of rural people and the anti-prohibition crowd. But Alfred Smith is unable to defeat Hoover, who was really a self-made millionaire, a very smart person, very wealthy. But Hoover wins in 1928, and he will continue this process of economic deregulation and the continued removal and rollback of progressive policies that place limits on big business and business in general. Economic transformation and problems. On the surface, the United States economy was roaring in the 1920s. The U.S. developed the highest standard of living in the world, meaning people's lifestyles were, on average, were the highest anywhere. Now, one of the reasons was because of the increasing value of the stock market. The stock market, in many people's minds, even today, which is not necessarily a good way to judge it, many believe that the stock market is a reflection of the overall economy. That if the stock market's doing good, then the overall economy is doing good. That's not always true, and this 1920s problem is an example of that. But the stock market early on in the 1920s and up to the middle of the 1920s, the stock market was rising and rising and rising. And of course, traditionally, it was always wealthier people that bought stocks and owned stocks. But as the news kept reporting the increased stock market and began implying that the stock market increases would never end, which please don't ever believe that. There's always corrections in the stock market. But the assumption was that rising stock prices would never end. And so the middle class, people who normally did not invest in stocks, began investing in stocks. They would, many of them had saved up for a lifetime money they had either in a bank or under their mattresses, and saving it for retirement, decided that they felt like they were missing out because the assumption that the stock prices would never end. They went ahead and took their money and invested it in the stock market. Some people even went one step further and began buying stocks, what's called on margin. And basically what on margin means is that you borrow money to buy stocks. Don't do that. Don't ever do that. That's like borrowing money to go gamble in Las Vegas. But anyway, you're buying on margin means that, let's say you want to buy $100 worth of stock. Well, to buy on margin, you would just put up, say, just as an example, $10, and your stockbroker would put up the other $90. So you've borrowed $90 to buy stocks. And and of course, since the stocks were always going to go up, once they went up high enough, you sold them, and everybody got their money back. You got to pay off the profits back what you owed from the stockbroker who loaned you the money. Plus, you still own the stock. So this was buying on margin. But this optimism, this assumption in stock prices really did not have a basis in reality, because there were some problems with the economy that were really not publicly addressed. These included the production of industries was outpacing the consumption and wages, meaning basically over time the industries, whatever they were making more than people were able to buy, and this is the problem. Stock values were not equal to book values of companies. Okay, basically that means that if you know anything about the stock market, there's a profit loss inherent within each company, and you have formulas which kind of tell you how much a company is worth, and usually that will equate to an equal stock market price. So you can, do your research, do your formulas, and it says, okay, the stock should be worth this much. Well, the problem was the stocks were worth way more than what they should have been, which means they were overvalued, which today they call that a bubble. But stock values were not equal to book values of companies, meaning the companies were not worth what people were paying for them. And the problem too was that profits from whatever the company made and profits from the increased stock price would go back into buying more stocks instead of to increased wages, which would allow theoretically consumers, because they're making more money, to buy more of the products. But basically, consumption and wages were stagnant while production continued to increase. So demand dries up. That means that those that are going to buy things, that's the demand. And supply and demand. Demand is the purchaser, the consumer, and the supplier is the business or the producer. So demand dries up, and when that happens, when the company begins to produce more than they can sell or more than consumers buy, well, eventually they're going to have too much stock and quit making it. And when they do that, the first thing you do when you're a company and you no longer are making things, or you are making fewer of something, is you lay off workers. Now, when the problem initially is that there's not enough consumers and there's not enough money out there in consumers' hands to purchase what you've made, when you lay off the worker, that means there's even less money in the economy, because those workers that were actually making money and buying some of the stuff now no longer have an income. So that means there's less money in the economy. That in turn leads other companies to lay off workers, which in turn means there's less money, once again, in the economy to purchase things, which leads another company to lay off workers. And it's a downward spiral that really theoretically could have no end until there's no more production and no more consumption. So this cycle of laying off workers, which in turn reduces consumption and wages, begins the downfall of the 1920s economy. Other economic weaknesses at the time: a decline in farming profits. One of the problems with this 1920s was that there was too much food out there. Agriculture was doing too well. Too many bumper crops. They were raising too much cattle, and there just wasn't enough consumers to buy all these things, and therefore you have to. That stuff will rot if you don't sell it. So you have to compete with your those that you're competing with to sell this. So you have to lower your prices in order to get rid of it. And so when you lower your prices too low, you no longer have a profit, and it really harmed the farmers. You also see a growing disparity in income, which is represented in those that own stocks and those that own the companies, and those that worked in the companies where wages were not rising. And many people were selling some of their stocks and using stock profits to buy real estate, oftentimes borrowing money to buy real estate. So all of these things were going on. So there was not a lot of money in the economy. Well, there wasn't enough money in the economy in consumers' hands to purchase all the things that were being produced, which greatly inflated, of course, and also there was greatly inflated stock prices. Well, eventually somebody's going to realize that they better sell their stock, because once people start selling stocks, and that means when there's more sellers than buyers, that means stock prices go down. And while early on into the mid and even into the late 1920s, people kept buying, eventually some saw the problems with the stock market, some saw the problems in the economy and began selling. Well, the way the stock market works, if you sell early, you sell at a high price. But the longer you wait and the more people that sell before you, that drives the price of the stocks down. And so when you do eventually sell it later, you're selling it for a lower price than the earlier sellers. So once the selling starts, everybody starts selling all at once, and it becomes a panic. And everybody has to get out of the stock market, because if they don't, they're going to lose everything. And this is called the Great Crash, and it happened in October of 1929. And the stock market lost a huge amount of its value. People lost their entire life savings. Those that bought on margin were now deeply in debt and couldn't pay back their debts to the brokers. And of course, there's the famous stories of people jumping out of skyscraper windows because they had lost everything in just a matter of days and weeks. And of course, the Great Crash will lead to the increases dramatically. That's one of the things about a downward spiral of an economy, is that unemployment is the main driver of the depression, because if there's nobody there to buy things, then nobody's going to make things, and nobody's going to provide services, and therefore corporations don't need people working for them. And of course, when that happens, that means there's less money to be spent, because those people that were in the past working are no longer working and don't have any money. Now, once this happens, these people who had borrowed money, they had, from banks, now they cannot pay back their loans. Also, because corporations are not selling as much as they were before, and they're beginning to go under, they also in the past had borrowed money from banks, and they are unable to pay back their loans to banks. And so the banks, because most of their money is out in loans and not in the bank, begin to fail. One of the things I want to explain is something called a run on banks. And what happens is banks, let's say you have 100 people that put their money in a bank. Okay, now the bank, in the savings account or in a checking account, whatever, but the bank does not hold all of that money all of the time. They pay the depositor, whoever puts their money in the bank, a certain interest rate, say 2% interest, to encourage them to put their money in the bank. But to make money, they have to loan some of that money out at a higher interest rate to bring in money from people they loan it to. So they might loan 70% of that money to people and charge 6 or 8% interest. And therefore, the difference between the 2% interest they pay and the 8% interest that they charge those that they give the loans to, that creates profit. So the upshot of this is, or the main point is, that they don't keep everybody's money in the bank. So only about 30% of the total money that they've received in deposits stays in the bank. Well, when people stop paying back their loans, that means that the banks no longer can potentially pay the interest that they're required to pay. It also means the banks can't give people their money when they show up at the door to get their money out. And people who deposit money in the banks know this. So these people would go and try to get their money out, because remember, there's only 30% of the total money left, so only 30% of the people are going to get their money out. Once all that money is taken out, the banks fail. They go under, and the other 70% that did not get their money, they are out of luck, because there is no protection or insurance for them at this time. So the banks begin to fail, and that causes even greater problems. So you have dramatic unemployment increases, you have bank failures, you have people that are now jobless, which means oftentimes they were living paycheck to paycheck, so they're homeless, they're hungry. At this time, there is nothing like unemployment insurance or welfare, anything like that. And Hoover's reaction, President Hoover, is to reject direct aid. He did not believe that giving citizens direct help was useful, and he felt like that would cause them to be dependent on this help and take away their motivation. He called for charity, local governments to help, but the problem was, in the past, local governments and charity had been able to solve some of these problems, but this problem was much bigger than past problems, and charity and local governments could not handle all of the problems of the homelessness, the hunger, and these things. He did establish the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which tried to funnel money into businesses to keep them afloat and keep them hiring, but it failed. It also led to protests, including the Bonus Army protests, which is a group of World War I veterans who demanded that they get some money, some back pay that was owed to them from Congress. It's based in the back in World War I, when men were drafted, some men were sent to fight in the war, and some men were put to work in factories. Well, the people that were put to work in factories were paid quite a bit more than those that were in the army, which was unfair because they both got drafted. It was just by luck that some went into the factories and some went into the to fight in the fight in Europe. So when those that were from fought in Europe came back, they demanded that they get recompensated, or they make up the difference in how much they lost. and Congress passed a law that said, yes, we will pay you the difference, but we won't pay you until 1945. Well, they needed the money now, and so they began marching on Washington, and eventually Herbert Hoover sent in the army to break up their protests. And it was not a popular decision, and Hoover was ridiculed immensely in the press. So effects of this depression, the bank failures, the lack of direct aid, the stock market crash. Well, hardship will impact all classes, but believe it or not, it will impact the richest and the poorest the least, because the people who were rich, most of them didn't have all their money in stocks, so they still had some money left over after the crash of the stock market. The very poor, they didn't have stock anyway, and they were already poor, so they might have been a little bit poor, but not much, because you can only be so poor. So they did not suffer, I guess, or their suffering did not change as much as the middle class. The middle class suffered more than anybody, because it was the middle class that were, for the most part, living paycheck to paycheck and had invested most of their money, or a lot of their money, in the stock market. And they lost both. They lost the investments in the stock market, and they lost their jobs, because they lost usually their homes. So there were thousands of homeless, millions of jobless. There was a lot of disillusionment, a lot of people angry. A lot of the homeless people, they created tent cities where they grouped together in tents, and these tent cities were called Hoovervilles, named after President Herbert Hoover, who they blamed for their misery. While the actual depression and crash itself wasn't necessarily Hoover's fault. His reaction, they blamed him for not helping enough. And with this going on, the banks failing, you have an election coming up, 1932 presidential election, where Hoover will run for re-election as a Republican. The Democrats will put forth as a challenger to Herbert Hoover Franklin Delano Roosevelt from New York. Background of Franklin Roosevelt, comes from a very wealthy family. His cousin was Theodore Roosevelt, a previous president, and he was very spoiled, came from a very wealthy family. But in his early adulthood, he contracted polio, which crippled him for the rest of his life, and basically put him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And some people argue that this humbling of him by this disease kind of changed him. Otherwise, he might have been what they might call a smug, wealthy person who couldn't understand or didn't appreciate the hardships of the poor. But the fact that he, a wealthy, person who had everything in front of him, was stricken with this terrible disease and this affliction, historians argue that it gave him this ability to empathize with the less fortunate. But it didn't. So a lot of them argue that that's why he did what he did, and why he was so supportive of programs to help poor people and those in need. He was governor of New York, and a very successful politician. Of course, as we saw earlier, he ran as the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party in 1920. But he runs on his own in 1932, and he cobbled together a coalition of voters and interest groups that included farmers, who were suffering greatly because of they had been suffering even before in the 1920s, but now they're suffering even more with the Great Depression. Labor workers, who were the ones that were probably taking the brunt of the Great Depression, because they were the ones that were laid off. They were the ones living paycheck to paycheck. Immigrants, who made up much of the labor force, and then Catholics. And he won a landslide victory over Herbert Hoover in the 1932 election. Here's the unemployment during the Great Depression, how it trended. As you can see, in 1929, right at the stock market crash, there was about 1 million people unemployed in the country. And as the spiral begins to go downward, where companies lay off people because there's not enough money in the economy, not enough consumers, you can see um, the trend go upward. Whereas in 1930, there's about 4 million, so it more than doubles. Then by 31, 8 million, it doubles again. And by 32, you're looking at about 11 million. And then in 1933, right when Roosevelt is elected, it reaches its peak at about 12 million people unemployed. In some areas of the country, it was like 25% of the population, but on average, it was anywhere from 15 to 20%. And then once his policies began to be implemented, his New Deal policies, you can see the unemployment rate go down. Of course, later on, you have the New Deal recovery, which really kicks in 1936. And then a new recession begins in 1938 when Congress demands that they draw back spending on New Deal programs. Then, of course, World War II begins in 1939 in Europe, and then when we enter the war, that is basically what ends our Great Depression. Just to note, and we'll talk about this more a little later, the New Deal does not end the Great Depression. The New Deal stopped the downward spiral of the Great Depression. The New Deal stopped the dramatic fall in unemployment during the Great Depression, but it did not end it, because only full employment can really end a depression. And the only way that we were able to implement full employment was a war at the time, and that did the job because people were drafted into the army. That puts them to work. People were put into factories to produce war-making materials, which put people to work, and the unemployment rate drops dramatically when World War II begins. Bank failures, 1929, when the crash hits early on, quickly, over 600 banks fail. Then you can see the gradual increase, 1930, 1931, and 1932. And then the very first, the beginning of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, when he really had not yet had time to implement his policies, you see the most bank failures, over 5,000 bank failures in 1933. And here's the election of 1932. As you can see, it is a landslide victory over Herbert Hoover for Franklin Roosevelt, one of the worst defeats for a sitting president in American history. As you can see, out of 39 million, almost 40 million votes, Roosevelt received almost 23 million to Herbert Hoover's 15, almost 16 million. But the electoral vote was even more of a landslide, with Roosevelt receiving 472 electoral votes to 59 for Hoover. And as you can see, it looks like there's only northeastern states that Hoover wins, and Roosevelt basically wins the rest of the country.